Alright, Salam Alaykum everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Guys, let me know if my mic cuts out or anything like that, or anything's wrong with the screen share, okay? I'm relying on you guys to let me know if there's any issues. So today's lecture, inshallah, we're going to be doing it on who wrote the Gospels. As we know, we have the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and we're going to be exploring on who authored these texts and stuff like that in today's lecture, inshallah, okay? So here's a quick outline for the presentation. Firstly, I'm going to be presenting the different views. First, the Christian view, and then the academic view. Secondly, I'm going to give the outline for the arguments for authorship and what Christians generally argue for why the Gospels were authored by who they believe they're authored by. Then I'm going to be giving the arguments for Gospel anonymity and why academics believe they were actually originally circulating anonymously. I'm going to be going through internal evidence, including the issues of internal identification or lack thereof, and the issue of interdependence, and the issues of basically the Gospels interdepending on each other. I'm also going to be going through the external evidence, which is the manuscript titles and the church tradition, and we're going to be looking at basically uniformity, independence, and reliability, or lack thereof, within this church tradition, and then we'll be concluding from there. There's also a few side points that I made throughout the lecture, and I just want to remind everyone, I'm going to try and keep it short for the sake of the presentation, but later, inshallah, I will be making a much more comprehensive version of this slideshow, maybe triple the size, that I can just share around and people can read in their own time and reference, inshallah. But yeah. So first we have here, this is the traditional authorship claims. Basically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospel of Matthew is said to be authored by this person named Matthew, who's considered to be a disciple of Jesus and has a role of a tax collector. And then we have Mark, who's meant to be the interpreter of Peter, the student of Peter, and he's not generally considered an eyewitness even by the Christians. They don't believe he's an eyewitness. Same for Luke. They believe he's a companion of Paul. So he was an eyewitness to Paul, but not an eyewitness to Jesus. And they believe he wrote the Gospel of Luke. He's also the author of the book of Acts. So whoever authored the book of the Gospel of Luke is the one who authored the book of Acts, and we'll get into that later. But yeah. And then the Gospel of John is said to be written by John the Evangelist, son of Zebedee, said to be an eyewitness, and is also considered to be the beloved disciple that's mentioned in the Gospel of John. Alright, so this is the Christian claim, just so everyone's up to speed with what the Christians claim. They claim two of them are by eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and two of them are by second-hand sources, Mark and Luke. This is what the Christians claim. Let's see what the academics say, right? So, as we see here, we have a few quotations from the New Oxford Annotated Bible, which first says, "Neither the evangelists nor their first readers engaged in historical analysis. Their aim was to confirm Christian faith. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. Thus, they do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teaching." We also have Richard Bolcom here. He himself wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which is basically dedicated to trying to prove the Christian position on authorship. And he himself admits that the position he holds to runs counter to almost all recent scholarship. And he goes on to talk about it here, right? So it's clear that the consensus of scholars is that basically these texts were anonymously authored and we don't know who actually wrote them, right? And they don't actually go back to the disciples or Luke, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. We also have Bart Ehrman in his book Forged. He says, "The anonymity of the gospel writers was respected for decades. When the gospels of the New Testament are alluded to and quoted by authors of the early 2nd century, they are never entitled, never named." That's from Bart Ehrman from Forged. So that's the academic position. So we can see here that the academic position is that they were anonymously authored, and the Christian position is that they were authored by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Okay? Here's a quick outline for the Christian arguments. So this is the arguments Christians give towards authorship. One, they say we have church attestation towards the authors of the Gospels from both early and authoritative sources. So they quote external evidence being like Papias, Irenaeus, and other 2nd century and early 3rd century church writers and church fathers who attest to who wrote the Gospels. They claim that these church attestations are independent, widespread, and uncontested. And by the way, can you guys let me know if you can see my mouse, or can you guys see my mouse when I'm moving it? Okay, good. Just so I can keep you guys here. Alright. So this says these church attestations are independent, widespread, uncontested. So that's what the Christians claim about the church attestation. So they claim, for example, when Papias attests to the gospel authorship, when Irenaeus attests to the gospel authorship, they're independent from each other, they're widespread, they're uncontested, unanimous, etc. They claim that there was no competing authors for the gospels like other anonymous works like the book of Hebrews. So essentially Christians say that, look, if the Gospels were really anonymous, why isn't there different contesting authors, just like the book of Hebrews? Since the book of Hebrews had like different authors that are presented, like Paul, Luke, etc. Another thing they say is that the manuscripts are unanimous on the same authors, both early and late. And they also claim that Gospels could have not circulated anonymously. For example, early Christian communities would need titles to archive, copy, and circulate texts. And then also they say that certain authors such as Luke and John claim either access to eyewitness testimony or eyewitness themselves. For example, John 21, the beloved disciple passage, and the we passages in Acts, and we'll get into that later and I'll explain what those things mean. Okay? Here's the outline to the academic argument. The authors of the Gospels do not identify themselves within their narratives or texts. So the gospel authors don't identify themselves, they don't say who they are, like, they don't say like who they're actually writing as. Someone in the chat saying there's an issue. If you guys have an issue with the stream, maybe leave the stage and join again and join the stream again. If the issue still persists, I'll just post the slides in the chat or whatever you guys want. But anyways, then the next point is that the Gospels are literarily interdependent and rely on each other for information. So the argument is going to be that the Gospels are dependent on each other and cannot be eyewitness testimonies because of that. And I'll get into more of that later. Also, that the early quotations of the Gospels appear with different titles and without an author, right? So we have early quotations, usually gives, different kinds of titles like the Oracles of the Lord or different kinds of titles for the Gospels that we have today, right? And sometimes they appear without an author, and these texts are quoted without an author. Next thing is that early manuscripts lack titles attributing them to their authors. So we have some manuscripts that don't give them any authors, and we'll get into that later. And the issue is that the uniformity that the Christians claim in the manuscript titles appear late. Also, the next two issues that the profiles of the authors are not consistent with the alleged authors. So what we know about the disciples and the apostles don't fit with what we know about the authors of the Gospels. And lastly, the church attestation to authorship is unreliable, dependent, and lack uniformity. Right? Very simple. And of course, there's going to be more things that are elaborated on throughout the presentation. So first, let's go through the internal evidence. When it comes to identification, the gospel authors do not claim to be written by any specific author themselves and write in third person, unlike other books in the New Testament. So what this means is the gospel authors themselves do not say that, I, Luke, am writing this, or I, John, the son of Zebedee, am writing this gospel for you guys, or me, Matthew the tax collector, is writing this. They're not identifying themselves as who they are. So we can't know from the text themselves who they are. This is different to, for example, the Apostle Paul. Paul identifies himself. He says, hey, I am Paul the Apostle, I'm writing, and this is my revelation. Or the book of Revelation. Some guy named John of Patmos, identifies himself in the book of Revelation, the opening sequence. But the Gospels don't display this. There's a bit of an exception with the we passages in Acts, and again, I'll get to that later, and I'll explain what that is later. Okay? Christians claim that this is completely normal within the genre and within other Greco-Roman biographies in antiquity, which to an extent is true, right? We do see this kind of like lack of direct self-identification in different Greco-Roman historiographies in antiquity. This is pointed out by the likes of Simon Gathercole in his paper about the alleged anonymity of the Gospels. However, the claim is a bit more than that. The issue isn't just that they don't identify themselves, but the issue is they go outside the convention of claiming eyewitness testimony or like claiming to be eyewitnesses. For example, when authors of Greco-Roman historiographical writings were eyewitnesses to the events they were recording, or they had access to eyewitnesses, they explicitly say so in the text, because eyewitness testimony was very highly valued and perceived as superior to hearsay. While Luke and John attempt to claim to receive potential information from eyewitnesses such as Luke 1 and John 21, which is a potential addition, but we'll get to that, Mark and Matthew make no indication or mention of access to eyewitness information or being eyewitnesses themselves. So again, I'll clarify, what does that mean again? It means that there's no claim to the information being received from an eyewitness or the author being an eyewitness themselves, right? And look here, we have examples here. So these are the list of examples, and this is just like probably 30% of the examples I can bring here. But it's just a quick short list. These are examples of Greco-Roman historical biographies that mention eyewitness access, right? You have Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, right? All these different writers. So Plutarch, Polybius, Dionysius. So these kind of writers, they would basically, if they had any access to eyewitness testimony or eyewitness information on a particular event or their whole text, they mention it explicitly if they were an eyewitness or they had access to eyewitness, right? So we have this practice attested even in forged historiographical works attributed to entirely non-existing authors. So even forged texts that are attributed to people who didn't exist still make clear who the author is meant to be of the text, even if the author didn't exist. It's even widely attested to in ancient Christian historiographical literature. For example, Eusebius and stuff like that, Life of Constantine, other writings. We even have this in Christian Apocrypha, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter. These other apocryphal texts attempt to self-identify of who the author is or who the author is meant to be, even if that author isn't actually a true attribution. So the issue here, again, just to summarize, Mark and Matthew, most specifically than Luke and John, do not show any claim to having access to eyewitness testimony in any way, shape or form, even though Christians claim Mark had the direct access to Peter's eyewitness testimony and Matthew was an eyewitness themselves. And also John and Luke failed to identify themselves within their texts as well. Let's get into more of the internal evidence. When it comes to the Gospel of John, Christians claim that the author of John explicitly identifies themselves as a witness, as an eyewitness, with the following passage. So this is from John 21 verse 24, which says, "This is the disciple, the one whom Jesus loved," because that's what's talking about in the context, "who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." So they say, look, the author of the Gospel of John is clearly identifying himself as the beloved disciple and an eyewitness, etc. But they don't read the passage carefully. Look what it says. "This is the disciple who testifies to these things, who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." Notice how here the author is separating himself from the beloved disciple. So clearly, according to the passage itself, the author is not the beloved disciple here. And I mentioned it in the threefold issue that I mentioned. The first issue, again, the author speaks in first person here and differentiates themselves from the beloved disciple. Secondly, another issue with trying to use this as proof of authorship is that the identity of the beloved disciple themselves is disputed. While most Christians hold to the idea that the beloved disciple is John, son of Zebedee, there's also different, identities that people give, whether it's ancient Christians or scholars themselves. Some say it's Lazarus, some say it's Thomas, some say that it's Mary Magdalene even. Some say it's not John the son of Zebedee, but John the elder, a different John. People like Richard Balkan put this forward. So notice we already see a dispute on who the authors are within Christian tradition and Christian scholarship. And lastly, John 21 is commonly believed to be an addition by a later author to the gospel. That's the general view held by textual critics and source critics today, like Bar Ehrman and others, for multiple reasons, right? One being that the gospel seems to end at the ending of John 20. So basically scholars conclude that the whole chapter of John 21 seems to be an addition either by a later author or the same author making an addition and a redaction to the text. Because basically John 20, if you read it, it talks about the purpose of the gospel, and it says we wrote these things down so that you may believe in Jesus Christ, etc., etc. And it seems to be the end of the gospel. But then, so the whole chapter 21 seems to be an addition. So those are the issues with the claim for John. When it comes for the Lucan authorship, here is the claims, right? So they say that the author of Acts also wrote the Gospel of Luke, which is true. They say that therefore the author of Acts and the author of Luke must have been a traveling companion of Paul, since he speaks of himself in the first person on 4 occasions. So what does this mean? If you look at the book of Acts, the book of Acts is basically a story talking about what the apostles did throughout their ministry and how they preached and Christianity spread. In some of the passages, the author of the book of Acts speaks in a first person plural and speaks about Paul and says, we traveled here or we traveled there, including himself in the story. So basically the argument is that the author of Acts is claiming to be a companion of Paul through those we passages, when he says we went here and we went there, which only happens on 4 occasions, and we'll get to the issue with those occasions. They also argue that this author was probably a Gentile because he was so concerned with the spread of the Christian movement among Gentiles. They also, another point they bring up is Paul himself speaks of a Gentile among his traveling companions in Colossians 4, naming him as Luke the beloved physician. They also argue that the Gospel of Luke fits with who a physician would be, it's like some kind of doctor and stuff like that. They argue that Luke has certain passages in the Gospel of Luke that indicate him knowing some medical information and stuff like that. They say therefore this person was likely the traveling companion of Paul, Luke the physician, the Gentile physician. That's the argument they make. Now again, some of these things are true, but some of these things are false, and we'll explain it now. Let's see. Yeah, here. So here are the we passages of Acts that I'm talking about. I'm going to read this passage quickly. I need everyone to pay attention carefully to what I'm about to read. This is from, I believe, Act 16. So it says here, once we were going to the place of prayer. So notice, once we were going to the place of prayer. So the author is speaking in first person plural. And it says, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, these men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved. She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. At that moment, the spirit left her. So basically, there was this fortune teller, and basically Paul rebuked the spirit within this fortune teller. But what's important to know is at the beginning of the passage, the author of Acts says, we were going to the place of prayer. So the author is saying that we went to this place. In verse 19 it says, when her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, these men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. The crowd joined in an attack against Paul and Silas, and then etc., and then they get flogged and thrown into prison and stuff like that. But what's interesting to notice is that the author, he says, we were going to the place of prayer in verse 16, and it says we were met by a female slave. But then when this female fortune teller gets them arrested, where does the author go? It says in verse 19, when her owners realized that the hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace, not dragged us into the marketplace. So where did Luke go in the story? Did he just disappear? What happened when they got thrown into jail? Was Luke also not in jail with them? Did Luke just run away? Where did he disappear in the story? So Bar Ehrman and many other scholars basically point out that there's a very peculiar and odd jump from, the pronouns here that seem to show a discrepancy between what the story is actually trying to tell. Even after the verses after, when Paul's actually in prison and stuff, Luke is nowhere in the story. So here, this is what I was saying. The problem here is clear. If the author of Acts was indeed part of the travels and adventures of Paul, why does he suddenly disappear from crucial parts of the story? Was he not with Paul and Silas when they were arrested? Did he go into hiding? Was he not preaching with them but only traveling? Scholars like Bar Ehrman propose different theories that scholars put forward, such as the possibility that the author of Acts was using a written source for Paul's adventures that included a first-person travel itinerary, which may or may not originate with some kind of companion of Paul. However, it does not follow that the rest of the third person parts of the story come from an eyewitness source. So basically, scholars debate as to whether the author of Acts was actually trying to claim to be an eyewitness to Paul's events, but what they do agree on is that he wasn't an eyewitness to those events due to the discrepancy in the weak passages and due to the discrepancy of other issues that we'll get into in a second, right? So essentially what I'm trying to say is that these passages, when the author of Acts is saying we were going here, we were going here, it does not show that the author was actually there during the time that Paul was traveling and doing whatever he needed to do. Acts versus Paul, here's another issue. Another big reason why scholars doubt that the author of Acts was actually a companion of Paul is that the way Paul is portrayed in Acts is different to Paul's genuine letters, including his experiences and theology, right? We have multiple examples. We have minor contradictions, we have major contradictions, and we have theological contradictions between the book of Acts and Paul, even though we're supposed to believe that the book of Acts was written by a companion of Paul, right? For example, the book of Acts states that when Paul went to Athens, he left Timothy and Silas behind in Berea, according to Acts 17, and did not meet up with them again until after he left Athens and arrived in Corinth. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul himself narrates the same sequence of events and indicates just as clearly that he was not in Athens alone, but that Timothy was with him, and possibly Silas as well. It was from Athens that he sent Timothy back to Thessalonica in order to see how the church was doing there, according to 1 Thessalonians 3, 1-3. So we already see some minor contradictions within that travels themselves, if we're supposed to believe that Luke here was traveling with them and he's the one writing them. But here where it gets bigger, we have major contradictions. For example, in the book of Galatians, letter to the Galatians, Paul is quite emphatic in the epistle to the Galatians that after he had his vision of Jesus and came to believe in him, he did not go to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles right away, right? And in Acts, Paul does exactly what he claims to not have done in Galatians. In the book of Acts chapter 9, after leaving Damascus some days after his conversion, he goes directly to Jerusalem and meets up with the apostles. We find this in Acts chapter 9 after he gets his vision of Jesus. This is a major contradiction. Why? Because him not meeting with the apostles is essential to his message in the book of Galatians, that he did not receive his information from men but rather God. Because his whole message in Galatians is like, he's saying basically, yo, I'm getting my revelation from God. I don't get my teachings from men. I don't get my knowledge about Jesus from men. I get my knowledge directly from revelation from God. This is why it's a major issue. And another thing is Acts versus Paul and the Jewish law, right? Acts in the Paul in the book of Acts basically is meant to be this strict law keeper in full harmony with the Jerusalem apostles. Paul insists that he's never broken the law. Luke depicts him as faithfully observing Jewish customs, for example, the purification rites in Acts 21. Accusations of violating the law are portrayed as false. So, in the book of Acts, Paul is this law keeper, he protects the law, he preaches the law. However, in Paul's own letters, he breaks the law when needed, tells Gentiles to never keep it. Paul says he lives like a Jew or like a Gentile depending on circumstance, according to 1 Corinthians. He rebukes Peter for being too obedient to Jewish law in Galatians 2. He insists Gentiles following the law undermines the Gospels. For Paul, Gentiles keeping Torah is not optional, it is a betrayal of Christ. Right? So, we see a big discrepancy here. How can the author of Luke and Acts be a companion of Paul if they get major points about Paul's theology wrong? Points that we know from Paul's authentic letters, because we know Galatians was written by Paul. We know 1 Corinthians was written by Paul, by consensus of academia. But it doesn't fit in line with how Acts portrays him. Alright? So those are the main issues, basically, with the book of Acts and Luke, when it comes to the internal evidence at least, right? Now let me go back a few slides that I missed. Alright, Matthew the eyewitness plagiarizer. So this is another internal evidence against traditional authorship in regards to the Gospel of Matthew. Let's read it together. One of the biggest issues that scholars point out with certain Gospel authors being eyewitnesses is their reliance on each other, especially Matthew's reliance on Mark. The consensus and clear demonstrable fact is that the synoptic Gospels are interdependent and that Mark is the first of the three. What does this mean? I'm not going to get too deep into this. This takes like a whole lecture itself to explain. but I'll summarize this and I can go over this in another lecture. But basically there's something called the synoptic problem, which means that the three synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we know them to be dependent on each other in some way, shape, or form. The reason we know this is because they have verbatim agreements in places they shouldn't have verbatim agreements. They have clear evidence of plagiarism that cannot be disputed in any way, shape, or form. And scholars also have a consensus that Mark is the first of the three gospels. So something called Markan priority. So what this means is that Matthew and Luke are relying on Mark, or Luke's relying on Matthew in some way, shape, or form. And following from now, we can see that Matthew actually copies 90 to 95% of Mark's gospel verbatim, including the story where Jesus recruits Matthew. So that means 90% of what you find in the Gospel of Mark, verbatim, you're going to find in the Gospel of Matthew. Right? If Matthew was an eyewitness, and remember, Christians say that Mark was the student of Peter, and that Matthew was an eyewitness. If Matthew was an eyewitness, he would not be taking from a secondary source to narrate events that he himself was present for, and many other events too. Why would an eyewitness take information from a non-eyewitness in his gospel? It makes no sense, and copy it verbatim. But here where it gets even funnier. In Matthew 9, it tells the story of how Matthew met Jesus. So Jesus meets this tax collector and says, "Come and follow me," and he becomes one of his disciples. But guess what? The story of how Matthew met Jesus is copied from the Gospel of Mark. So Christians want us to believe that, this is ridiculous, Christians want us to believe that Matthew was actually there, and then he wrote a gospel to talk about how he met Jesus, but instead of recalling it from his own memory or from what he remembered or what he knows, he copies it off someone who wasn't there. That's like me getting into a car crash or something, and then I'm going to write about the car crash later, and instead of just writing about what happened in that car crash, I ask someone who's not there, and I copy their story of what happened when they weren't even there. That's how ridiculous it is. Right? So let's see here. And I posted the verses here as well. Yeah, by the way, guys, in regards to the stage, it's giving different numbers and stuff. Just don't worry about that. As long as you're here, you can just listen, inshallah. But I think it's like messing up or glitching out or whatever. But don't worry about that. So yeah, this is a big issue. Why would an eyewitness copy off a non-eyewitness? You know what I mean? It doesn't make any sense. And as well, if anyone has any questions in the chat, there will be a small Q&A section if needed later. But if anyone has any questions while it's ongoing, you can post it in the chat and ping me and stuff. So let's get into the external evidence now. Christian apologists claim that the manuscripts show uniformity in titleage regarding the four Gospels. For example, they mention Papyrus 4. It's a manuscript that contains a flyleaf mentioning Evangelion kata Mattheon, which means Gospel according to Matthew. This manuscript is typically dated from the late 2nd or early 3rd century. And they say, look, this shows early evidence of titles being applied to the Gospels, the same titles that we have today. The issue with this claim is that there are other manuscripts from this time that show no titles, such as Papyrus 1. This manuscript dates to the early 3rd century and potentially earlier than P4, and shows no title attributing to any author. We know this because we have the chapter heading as shown in the picture here, meaning there is nothing above that part of the manuscript. So this is a picture of P1, Papyrus 1. It's the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, I believe. And see this Greek letter alpha at the top. It's basically the chapter or page number, which is always the highest point in this the page. So that means under it there's no title, besides it there's no title, and clearly there's no title attributed to this manuscript, which is a big issue. Moreover, the manuscripts that they bring up, such as Papyrus 4 and other manuscripts, come way after the titles were already attributed to the Gospel, so it's not giving us any new information. Alright? More issues is that these manuscripts, and this is what I just said 2 seconds ago, all these manuscripts appear decades and centuries after the traditional authors of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John are already attributed to them. The following here is a full list of New Testament papyri with some form of a title. This is a screenshot from Titles in New Testament Papyri by Garrick V. Allen. You guys can look up the paper. He goes through every single papyri of the New Testament that has a title attributed to it. And as we can see, the earliest these three we have are, I believe I put P1 by accident. I believe to put P4, I believe. P75, P66, which all post 3rd century, 4th century, right? And as you can see, even the earliest titles for the letters of Paul and stuff like that come way later, but that's another discussion for another day. And even some of these, for example, page 66, as we can see here, it's not part of the initial production layer. Most likely, Garrick V. Allen argues that the title written on the P66 is a title that was put on later by a later scribe on the same manuscript. So there's even more issues with that, but that's like things that is more intricate and takes more time to get into. And the third issue, this one's a bit more complicated and you guys need to pay attention to understand. But essentially the third issue is that we know for a fact these are later titles attributed to the texts and not titles used by neither the authors or the earliest communities and would not even be used to denote authorship. In fact, every early usage of this formula in antiquity is not an authorship attribution at all. What is this formula? The formula I refer to is when it says according to Mark, gospel according to, Matthew, gospel according to John, according to, Luke, whatever it is. This is called the kata andra formula, right? The kata plus name formula. It's in the accusative form, grammatically speaking, as found in New Testament papyri, and is always used as an editor title in all contemporary ancient works. So basically there's a difference between the genitive form and the accusative form grammatically, and the titles are found in the accusative form. Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Matthew, as opposed to the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Mark and stuff like that, right? Which would be more commonly used to refer to oneself as an author. However, this formula of kata Mattheon, kata Lucan, right, these kind of things, they are not used to refer to one's own authorship and stuff like that, right? So it doesn't make any sense. And here you have a paper from Matthew D.C. Larson. He has a whole paper dedicated to just what I just spoke about, or a whole section of that paper. And he, in his concluding statements, he says, there is no historical precedent for treating katandra as ascribing authorship to a text. The historical precedent for the formula points to a corrector or editor of a pluriform and fluid textual tradition, usually with a near-mythical author figure like Homer, or with no author at all. The earliest use of the formula applied to every gospel text likewise do not fit neatly onto conventional ways of ascribing authorship, but seem to be doing something else altogether. So not only are the names attached to the Gospels not indicative of the real names of the people who wrote them, but the attached names were not initially even meant to ascribe an author of a book, but a corrector of one instantiation on the pluriform and open textual tradition of the Gospel. So even the titles given later are not necessary evidence of attempting to ascribe authorship. So that's essentially what it is for the manuscripts and the titles. Now, inshallah, I'm going to be getting into the church tradition. Looks like we're zooming through this lecture, so that's good. I thought it would take longer, but it looks like it's not taking that long. The next part is external evidence in regards to the church. As pointed out earlier, the Christian claim is that the church tradition is proof that the Gospels were always known and circulated with their original authors. The two main writers that Christians bring up is Papias of Hierapolis and Irenaeus of Lyon. So who are these two people? Irenaeus is writing around 180 AD and is said to be a good proof of authorship. Why? Because he names all four Gospels and their authors, which is true, and who they were. Moreover, he has a direct line of apostolic succession going back to the Apostle John through Polycarp. In his famous text against heresies, He names all four Gospels and refers to their content explicitly and gives mostly theological justification for taking the Gospels as authoritative. So Irenaeus, in his 5-volume work against heresies, he says, we have these four Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. They were written by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and here they are, right? Here's the earliest, clearest attestation we have towards all four Gospels and who they were written by, around 180 AD, which, reminding you, is a whole century after the Gospels were written, right? And it's even longer. The next one is Papias. Papias is writing around 120 to 130 AD. He's said to be a hearer of John, according to Irenaeus, and is used as a key witness to Gospel authorship. We only have surviving fragments of his writings, mostly preserved by Eusebius in the 4th century. In his fragments, he refers to 2 writings and attributes them to Mark and Matthew. Right? I just want to address a quick question in the chat. I am curious about anyone reading. Are you guys really meeting Christians that think the titles count as evidence? Brother, there's papers written about this trying to use the titles as evidence. Cataloging the titles, saying this is proof of evidence, authorship. Christian apologists use this all the time. Go watch people like Inspiring Philosophy, etc. But anyways, inshallah, the Q&A will be open later. So, first let's look at Papias. Guys, this gets a bit complicated, so you guys need to pay attention, okay? And again, you can watch it later. We'll probably be uploading it to the Islam YouTube channel and stuff like that, and I'll let you guys know where to get that later. But let's look at Papias first. The first attestation we're going to look at is the quotation of Papias found in his fragments, and it goes as the following. I want you guys to listen carefully. And the prebester said this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessity of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took special care, not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into his statements. So very important to highlight, Papias says Mark wrote this text that records things about Jesus. He says it wasn't in order, and he made sure not to include anything wrong, and he made sure not to leave out anything that's true and what he heard. And when it comes to Matthew, this is what he says. He says Matthew put together the oracles, or logia, the word for it in Greek, of the Lord in the Hebrew language, in the Hebrew dialectos, and each one interpreted them as best as he could. So again, Papias is saying, look, Matthew wrote this oracles, which he doesn't say gospel, by the way, he says oracles, and he said he wrote it in the Hebrew language. Okay? Academics argue that this statement from Papias is not actually referring to the Gospels we know of to be the Gospel of Mark and Matthew. We know this because the description that is given by Papias do not fit. Notice what he said. It was not, however, in order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. So he's talking about the Gospel of Mark, but the Gospel of Mark, we know today, is actually an ordered narrative. It starts from a certain part in the story. It has a certain chronology. It ends with the crucifixion. It ends with the resurrection. It's a completely proper biographical narrative from beginning to end. It's not some haphazard statements. What Papias is talking about fits better with other Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, which is just basically a randomly compiled set of sayings and actions of Jesus. So that's what Papias seems to be describing with Mark, especially with the other statement he says about Mark, when he says he took special care not to omit anything. So Papias is saying that Mark left nothing out from what he wrote. Does this fit with the Gospel of Mark we have today, which is the shortest out of the 4? Doesn't include the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't include the Sermon on the Mount of Olives, doesn't include the nativity narrative of Jesus' parents going to Egypt, or traveling from Bethlehem to Nazareth and vice versa, doesn't include the post-resurrection appearances, doesn't include the Jesus anointing Peter in Matthew 16, doesn't include all the I am statements found in John, doesn't include all the debates he has with the Pharisees found in John. there's so many narrative details, even doesn't include basically the details of the temptation of the desert. Mark is the shortest gospel of them all, and you can literally read it in 2 hours. And there's so much details that the Gospel of Mark leaves out. And we know that's normal because he was actually the first gospel, and the others were adding more things, like Matthew, like taking Mark and adding more things. But the issue is, you can't say that what Papias is referring to is the Mark we know of today. It's not the same. He's not referring to the same text. He's referring to a different text. So we just went over that. Now let's go over Matthew. He says Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language. The second part of Papias' statement in reference to Matthew also does not fit into the Gospel of Matthew we know. Firstly, the term Gospel is not used, Evangelion, within Papias' statement, but rather the term Logia, oracles, which is less befitting to describe a Gospel narrative like the Gospel of Matthew and Mark are. Secondly, and more importantly, Papias here indicates that these oracles were written in the Hebrew language, which is factually incorrect about our Gospel. The Gospel of Matthew was written in Koine high-level Greek. So Papias is saying that Matthew wrote in Hebrew, but Matthew actually wrote, or whoever authored the Gospel of Matthew wrote in Koine Greek, right? Hold on. Yeah, wrote in Koine Greek, which doesn't fit the author at all. We know this for a fact because of manuscript evidence, and we know this because Matthew takes off Mark's Greek and stuff like this, and he translates non-Greek phrases into Greek in his Gospel. So that's like explicit evidence again of Papias' statement not referring to it. Another issue, and this is the funny part, is Papias' unreliability. Another issue with Papias is that he is an unreliable conveyor of information. The person who preserves his writings, Eusebius himself, argues that he was never actually in contact with apostles, and moreover that Papias is of low intelligence. This can be shown through traditions that Papias relays, one being the tradition regarding Judas. Papias says that as a punishment for his betrayal, Judas's body bloated up so much to the size of a cart, and the pus was coming out of his genitals, and his eyes could not be seen, etc. So, the Gospel of Matthew says that Judas died by hanging himself. Papias says that Judas died by bloating up like a balloon from the girl, like from Willy Wonka, and basically his head was so big. This is what Papias says. His head was so big that even his head couldn't fit into where a wagon would fit into an alleyway. Not his body, just his head, right? This is obviously a legendary story, and it's completely contrary to the Gospel of Matthew's story of Judas dying, showing more evidence that he wasn't referring to the Matthew we knew, otherwise he wouldn't clearly contradict Matthew's version. So Papias is just a joke in terms of reliability. Many scholars like Richard Carrier call him a gullible conveyor of information, etc. The next person is Irenaeus. We mentioned earlier why Christians use Irenaeus, however there are clear-cut issues with him. Firstly, the claim that he has a direct line to the Apostle John is ahistorical. Polycarp was not a disciple of John the Apostle. He mentions none of his writings and shows no awareness that he was a student. So Polycarp doesn't conform to like Johannine theology. He doesn't mention the Gospel of John's writing, and he doesn't reference the Gospel of John in any way, shape, or form. He doesn't say that he was a student of John. He doesn't mention any known connection. And there's much more, but I'm not going to get too deep into this. But essentially, we know for very strong reasons why Polycarp was not actually a disciple of John. So Irenaeus has no direct line to the Apostle John. Secondly, Irenaeus is either known to lie or be clearly mistaken on information that he claims to come from the apostles. For example, and this is interesting, he argues that Jesus lived past 50 to refute Gnostics. So basically, we all know that Jesus lived around to when he was 30 to 33. Christians and Muslims agree on this. However, Irenaeus, because he was debating Gnostics, and Gnostics held to the position that he died around that age for their own theological reasons, he comes up with a different age and says Jesus lived past 50. And he gives different arguments for it. He says, for Jesus to die for all of humanity, he has to live through all the ages of humanity and these kinds of things. But the issue comes here is that Irenaeus not only makes his own arguments to why Jesus was older than 50 years old, but he says this information comes from the apostles, right? So look what he says here. He says, but from the 40th and 50th year, a man begins to decline towards old age, which our Lord possessed while he still fulfilled the office of a teacher. Even as the gospel and all the elders testify. Notice, it says the gospel and the elders testify. Those who were conversant in Asia with John, the disciple of the Lord, affirming that John conveyed to them that information. And he remained among them up to the times of Trajan. Some of them, moreover, saw not only John, but the other apostles also, and heard the very same account from them, and bear testimony as to the validity of the statement. So Irenaeus is saying that, hey, even the apostles and those who followed the apostles and other apostles testify that Jesus lived this old. And this information came to us through oral tradition. So he's claiming a direct chain of transmission to the apostles about this, but we know this is completely false information. So Irenaeus is either completely lying, or his sources of information on the apostles are dubious and just false and unreliable. And finally, but not least, Irenaeus is not an independent source for gospel attestation, because he's getting his tradition from Papias, the one we just went over. We know this because he carries the same mistake of a Hebrew gospel, showing the source is not independent. And this is something common you'll see among the church fathers, that they carry over this mistake that goes all the way back to the Papias tradition and claim that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew when it wasn't. Okay, so that's for Irenaeus. Here's a bit more issues with the church tradition. As I explained earlier, Christians often claim that attestations for the gospel authors are independent. This, however, cannot be proven, and moreover has evidence to the contrary. We have evidence that the attestations are taken from each other and mostly originate with Papias, especially in regards to Matthew and Mark. We know this because they take from the mistakes as each other, such as Matthew writing first or him writing in Hebrew. Camille Gregor, a New Testament scholar, provided a diagram for how we can explain the early attestation for Mark. So he says Papias gave the information to Irenaeus. Clement, Tertullian, and Pseudo-Hippolytus get it from Irenaeus. Cyprian gets it from Tertullian. Dionysius from Origen, etc., etc. This shows that these attestations are not independent evidences. The mere fact that all these depend on an unreliable source like Papias is extremely problematic, given Papias' unreliability and the fact that he wasn't even referring to the Gospels, like we explained earlier. Now, uniformity. We went over issues with reliability, we went over issues with independence, and now we're going to go over issues with uniformity into the Gospel authors. Christians often claim that the attestations to the authors were unanimous and uniform. This may appear true at first, but in reality we find dispute in the identification due to specific issues like the identity of the beloved disciple. While the church did agree that the beloved disciple was the responsible eyewitness for the information in the Gospel of John, there was no uniformity on who exactly was this beloved disciple. Ancient writers such as Polycrates of Ephesus argue that the John here was actually an aristocrat John from a priestly family, based on the high priest knowing the beloved disciple. Modern scholars also hold to different theories to the beloved disciple. Richard Bauckham argues for John the Elder, not John son of Zebedee. James Charlesworth posits Thomas as the beloved disciple. Other scholars say it's Lazarus. Some even say it was Mary Magdalene. Right? So who this beloved disciple is not really clear. In fact, a lot of scholars argue that the beloved disciple figure in the Gospel of John is not actually a historical character, but rather he's a fictitious literary character. He's basically meant to convey some kind of point or theme. It is not an actual person, right? And that's why the author intentionally left it ambiguous to who the beloved disciple was. So Christians say, oh look, everyone agreed it was John, everyone agreed it was John. Well, not everyone agreed who the beloved disciple was, and not everyone agreed on which John it was. So really there's not actual uniformity. So that's in regards to uniformity. Next we'll get into author profiles, okay? And just before we get into author profiles, again, to sum up with the external evidence. So again, Christians use early church traditions to say this is attestations of the Gospels. They mention Irenaeus, they mention Papias, they mention other church fathers. Again, but there's issues with reliability. Irenaeus and Papias are not reliable for the traditions they convey from the apostles. They are not independent of each other. And the church attestation towards the authorship is not uniform, as I just mentioned. The three main issues. Next, let's get into author profiles. And for here, I'm going to be referencing Catherine Heiser's Jewish literacy in Roman Palestine, texts and studies in ancient Judaism. One of the most powerful arguments that academics mention, especially in regards to John and Matthew, is that a Galilean residents, especially a fisherman like John, would not be able to compose a gospel like we have. The Gospels we have are highly sophisticated theological narratives with intricate cross-references and storytelling elements. Literacy rates in Roman Palestine were less than 3%, and the percentage of people who could write a composition like the Gospels are even lower than the ones who could do basic reading and writing. So Catherine Heiser and Bart Ehrman go over this a lot in their respective works about how when it comes to literacy, it's not as simple as you think. It's not like today we learn how to read and write in school and that's it, and you can write stories by the time you're 10. No. There was only such a small amount in the population, 3%, who could only just read, do basic reading, let alone writing. And from those who learned how to write, they barely would have learned to write certain letters. And from those who wrote letters, all they learned how to do is basically just copy copy other scribal text, right? They're basically just meant to be scribes, copy other manuscripts, just copy the letters, copy the words. It takes a whole other level of sophistication and education, which only happened if you came from an educated and high-class family, for you to be able to compose a whole gospel narrative with sophisticated Greek and sophisticated cross-references and a sophisticated theological narrative. It does not fit into the profile, especially of John and Matthew. And yes, while Matthew was a tax collector, and that means he had to have some basic level of writing, which is fine, all that required was basic writing to tally up numbers. But it doesn't mean he was able to compose a whole gospel narrative, which would have required a high level of education, which wouldn't have been available to the common Galilean, especially a fisherman like John. According to the book of Acts, John was an unlettered and uneducated man. I believe it's in Acts 14:13, right? I believe the Greek word says agrammatos, right? Which means without grammar or without letter, as in he's not able to write. For someone to compose a gospel like John, he would have to go through rigorous education, which was virtually impossible for a Galilean fisherman. So it doesn't fit into the author profiles. So that's most of the information or the arguments. Now we're going to get into like concluding issues. Since we argue that these gospels are anonymous, what Christians may come to us and ask, how did these titles get their names? How did these gospels get attributed to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John? Why would the gospels get attributed to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John when, for example, Mark and Luke is not an eyewitness? They say this is evidence that the church fathers were not lying and making up church attributions or gospel attributions, because they would have named all of them as important eyewitnesses instead of naming Mark and Luke, who are not eyewitnesses and stuff like that, or Matthew, who's a lesser known disciple. But the thing is, this is just not true at all. All four figures have very good reasons to be attributed to their respective gospels, and we'll go through all of them one by one. So before we get into how they actually got named, let's just go over all four authors. First of all, John. John needs no explanation. He's meant to be this beloved disciple. He's meant to be one of the closest disciples of Jesus. There's plenty of reason why people wanted to attribute writings to him, especially in the context of where these writings were being attributed. The time of Irenaeus, where there was all these gospels circulating around, and all he wanted to do was pick out certain gospels to make them out to be authoritative, to refute people who believed to be heretics. And there was a lot of false attribution, false apostolic successions and attributions going around. When it comes to Luke, people say, why would they attribute it to Luke? There's no reason to attribute it to Luke. Yes, there is. Paul was considered one of the most highly respected figures among the proto-Orthodox church. For you to have an eyewitness from a traveling companion of Paul would be extremely valuable. So no, it's not just for no reason and stuff like that. There is a reason. And now let's get into the explanation. Let's get into how these were named. So let's read from here. We can easily explain how late 2nd century writers got the gospel attributions we have now. Both Mark and Matthew share the Papiast tradition. As we explained earlier, it is not an actual good reason to show that they authored the Gospels, nor is even referring to the Gospels, but it seemed to have been good reason enough for writers like Irenaeus and others, given that they rely on it. Matthew also has the unique reference to Levi as Matthew, which may have been taken as a sign for early writers that this author was changing his own name in his gospel to Matthew. So basically, people argue that, look, in the Gospel of Matthew, this person that's called Levi in Mark and Luke is actually called Matthew in Matthew 9, which shows that maybe this was actually being written by Matthew. That's why he would change the name. So that's how Mark and Matthew would have got their names, based on the Papist tradition. And I already showed a flowchart showing where this tradition would have spread. And there's other reasons as well. When it comes to Luke, the inference would have been made by Christian writers the same way that Christians today do it. That the author was an alleged companion of Paul. They get this from the weak passages in Acts, and by elimination it can only be Luke the physician, including the fact that the Gospel of Luke has some unique elements that allude to him being a physician. That's how it would have naturally been attributed to Luke. When it comes to John, it was attributed because of the beloved disciple connection in John 21. And Christian writers must have concluded it to be John because the inner circle of Jesus, because this is how they identified the beloved disciple. Christian writers, they're basically like, okay, who is the inner circle closest disciples to Jesus? You got Peter, John, James, right? It can't be Peter because Peter is often doing things with the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. They're shown together, so it's not the same person. And it can't be James because James died early on and he was a martyr for Christianity. He was actually, I believe, to be the first martyr of Christianity, according to the Christian tradition. So then what leaves us that with John, son of Zebedee. So they say John, son of Zebedee was the beloved disciple. And since the John 21 refers to the beloved disciple testifying to the contents of the gospel, they say it's written by John, son of Zebedee. Very natural explanation. This is exactly how it developed. Even scholars like Bart Ehrman say it's more likely that just basically that there was some kind of manuscript in Rome going around with these titles and it just became popular over time, which is, very natural to how false attributions occur in antiquity. So, conclusion, just to summarize again, the reasons Christians today propose for traditional authorship are weak and have great critiques. This includes issues with lack of internal identification, lack of mention of eyewitness access. It includes odd dependence of alleged eyewitnesses of Matthew on non-eyewitnesses like Mark. It includes manuscripts using later attributed titles and also some lacking titles. It includes disagreeing and dependent and unreliable church attestations. And includes the issue of the profiles of the gospel authors. So that's essentially it for the slides themselves. Now, if anyone has any questions, I'll take some questions in the chat. I don't know if we'll bring anyone up, if it's even possible. Yeah, I believe I can invite people to speak, so whoever wants to come up can raise their hand and come up and stuff. Whether you're Christian, Muslim, to ask any questions. Besides that, put any questions in the chat. If there's not any significant questions, we'll just end it there, inshallah. But I'll give you guys a minute to have any questions. About what I said. Can you go into Papias a bit more? I can go into Papias quite a bit more, but it depends what do you want to know. Because again, this is a very summarized lecture. And actually, thank you that you asked that, because I want to remind everyone, for every slide in this lecture, I can make 10 slides on its behalf, or 20 slides on its behalf. This lecture could be like 10 times the size it is. But again, I wanted to make it condensed, go through information succinctly, easily. And what I'll be doing, inshallah, later on is that I'll basically I'll be making a more comprehensive version of this presentation. I'll basically make it like maybe 100 slides or 50 slides just on gospel authorship, and for everyone to share it around. You can share it with Christians and Muslims and read it in your own time. And I'll put the references and stuff like that, because I know a lot of the times here I didn't give the direct references and stuff like that, just because it's meant to be condensed. The supposed apostolic succession go from John to Polycarp to Papias? Someone's asking in the chat. No, it goes allegedly from Papias to John and Polycarp to John. So they're both independent witnesses to John. But funny enough, Eusebius himself, the man who preserves Papias' writings, calls Papias low IQ and says, no, Papias wasn't actually a hearer of John the Apostle, but rather you guys are mixing up John the Elder and John the Apostle, and he actually knew John the Elder and if that's even true at all. So even church fathers themselves are saying, hey, this apostolic succession is not true. We don't even have to do the work. Church fathers did it themselves, disputing among themselves about apostolic succession. When you refer to Papias tradition, what are you specifically referring to? So what I'm referring to is basically, Papias has this 5-volume work that only fragments of it survive through Eusebius. And in those fragments, he gives certain sayings about the Gospels, or certain sayings about Mark and Matthew, certain sayings about Jesus, etc., etc. And this is found, and you can just search up the Papias Mark and Matthew reference. I'll give you the reference in a second. But you can find this on any page. It's not like anything obscure. You find this everywhere. It's a very famous quotation from Papias. So that's what I'm referring to when it says, I'll talk about the Papias tradition.
Assalamu Alaikum, can you hear me?
Yo, what's good? Salam.
First of all, Akhi, it's a beautiful presentation. I know it's like you condensed everything, right? Because it's a lot of scholarship trying to summarize it. But I wanted to ask, throughout all of this, like, what do you think are like the 2 or 3 like strongest questions to ask someone when it comes to this, right? Like, you can ask someone, why does Matthew copy from Mark if Matthew is a disciple and Mark isn't? Also, like, what are the strongest things to put someone under the lens of?
What I think is, hold on, I just need to put my phone in the charger. Give me 1 second. But yeah, if you can hear me while I'm charging my phone, basically.
I can hear you.
Hold on, I just don't want my phone to die. But yeah, that one is very strong in my opinion, personally, because it's just completely nonsense. Because not only is he like taking information from Mark, he's copying the story near verbatim. Like, just imagine the scenario, Abdurrahman, right? I get into a car crash or a car accident. Me and you get into a car accident. And then later on, I go and write a report about the accident. And I talk about how I was there. Which, by the way, it's weird that he's talking about it in third person anyways. Because in the passage, again, read it. He doesn't say, oh, I met Jesus. Let's read it again, right? As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. Does this sound like Matthew's the one writing it?
No.
And on top of that, he's taking this from someone who wasn't there. We know this because the exact sentence structure is the same. Like, why we know like the plagiarism is so explicit is because like it fits with everything we know to be plagiarism. Like, for example, Bar Ehrman does this very good experiment, Abdurrahman, right? What does Bar Ehrman do? Every year when he starts his new class, he does this experiment. He walks into his classroom. Before saying anything, he closes his laptop, opens his laptop, picks up a jacket, throws something in the bin, writes something on the board, erases off the board, does a bunch of things for 5 minutes, then tells everyone, write down what happened. You will never find them writing the exact same story. Sometimes they're not even accurate, but most of the time they'll be accurate, but not even writing it the same way, because you'll just put things in a different order, or even in the same order you use different words. You know, he threw it into the bin, or he threw it, like, or he closed the laptop, or he turned off the laptop, whatever. Like, there's different verbs to describe these things. We know Matthew's copying from Mark because there's verbatim agreement in the text. 90% of Mark is verbatim taken by Matthew. Not only that, but even authorial comments. So what's authorial comments? I wish I included this in the presentation, but basically, if you know, Abdurrahman, when you write a sentence in English, you know how you can usually put something in brackets to clarify a statement? And it's it gives a thought from your own mind, right? Mark has one of these, right? He says something, then he says, let the reader understand, in brackets. Matthew has the same sentence, but he also takes the part in the brackets. It's impossible that they would have had the same thought that came up to their mind and they put it in the same sentence. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, final. And I get you.
It's like when you copy. It's like when you copy off ChatGPT or like an article and you don't take out the footnote. You know what I mean? Like, you don't take out the footnote, so you know exactly which article it's taken from. So that's how we know Matthew's copying from Mark. We know that for 100% fact. It's not a disputed thing. So that's one of the strongest ones. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Do you think I was gonna say? Do you think like is there any other like question that you would ask someone when it comes to the Gospels that like
direct
that's
question?
Really yeah, or anything like that. Like why does Matthew copy from Mark, etc. Like what other question would you ask that's like, you know, tough for them to answer?
I would let's say for example the authorship profiles. This is like one that's easy because I'm trying to keep it to things that don't require like robust explanation, right? Because that's kind of like
Yeah,
why you're going for, right? The author
yeah,
profiles
yeah,
here,
yeah.
right? According to the book of Acts, John was unlettered, he was uneducated. Agrammatos, that's what it calls him, I believe the Greek word, right? He couldn't read, he couldn't write. He was a Galilean fisherman. The literacy rate in Roman Palestine was so low, and by the way, I'm actually being nice here because I didn't include the actual percentages. 3% is just those who could do a tiny bit of basic reading. Catherine Heza in her study includes all those in the 3%. But really, those who could actually write a full, sophisticated gospel narrative, brother, 0.0000 whatever. Like, you know, obviously I'm making
SubhanAllah.
up a number, but it's very low because there's multiple stages to literacy in Roman Palestine. Like I told you, I said earlier. First, you had to be able to do basic reading. Then some basic writing with just copying some letters, which took like years and years, by the way. Again, according to the highest world leading authorities in this topic, like Catherine Hessa. She wrote a whole book about this. And
Mm.
from then, these people would usually just be writing, you know, in just copying of other manuscripts, copying and relaying the manuscript and stuff like that. It's basically the difference between someone who's learning Arabic to be able to just copy the Quran into a book to practice Arabic, which anyone can do. A non-Arabic speaker can do that with practice, obviously, right? It takes a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah,
practice to like get the letters right. But to actually compose the Quran or another Arabic poetic text, that's a different level. Different level of
exactly. Yeah,
literacy.
yeah,
Not only
yeah.
that, but don't forget, in Greek, there was almost no one who would know to write or read, let alone write and read in multiple languages, let alone write and read in sophisticated Greek. From a Galilean fisherman, bro, John had no time to learn to read or write. He was not some high educated, rich family. He was busy fishing from he was 12 years old. That's what people did back then. Your father was a fisherman. You grow up, you're 12 years old. You're not going to school. You're learning to fish from day one. And you got to make a living every day. So
SubhanAllah.
it doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense at all. And it gets more detailed than this. But if you want more info, you can go to like Bart Ehrman's blogs about literacy. This info is found everywhere about and stuff like this. Even I just want to emphasize again about the Matthew the tax collector. They say, oh look, since Matthew was a tax collector, they say, oh, he must have been able to read and write and stuff like that. So that proves he fits. But like I said earlier, all the tax collector had to do was basically just be able to like write basic notes and basically like basic number tallies to count the money.
Yeah.
And he could have done it in any like Aramaic whatever or just tallies or whatever. It doesn't mean he was able to write sentences and paragraphs and a whole gospel narrative with intricate cross references and theological messages and etc. It doesn't fit into Galilean
SubhanAllah.
profile. Yeah, so those are the main things I would
Yeah.
mention. Other things are very strong as well, but require more explanation. Like I said, Irenaeus' oral tradition being unreliable, Papists being unreliable, Acts versus Paul. This one's like very strong, but again requires more explanation. That Acts doesn't fit with Paul's theology, you know. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's the main things I would say if that answers your question, inshallah.
No, Jazakallah khair, Habib. I'll stop there now. I think there's some guys with some good
Yeah,
questions.
yeah,
But thank you,
yeah.
Akhi. Very
No
beneficial.
worries, no worries. Yeah. The person, what's your name? I can't see your name. Hold on. I'm on streamer mode, so I can't read your name. But yeah, whatever your name is, go ahead. I can't hear you if you're trying to speak. Maybe you want to go down back to the audience and I'll bring you back up if you're trying to speak. Or mute and unmute. While you figure that out, answer a question in the chat by Bariso. If John possibly had followers write for him his narratives, could it still contradict that John wrote it? One, we have no evidence that this was written by a scribe instead of John himself. Two, the Christians actually claim that John was the one writing it. Right? The problem with this scribe thing is that it doesn't work. I'll tell you why. Let's take the Quran as an example. The Quran's text comes as it is, and when the scribes copy the Quran, they copy the Quran as it is. No one says, secular academics don't say that Prophet Muhammad couldn't have composed this is not like, this doesn't fit into like the Arabic of that time or whatever it is. When it comes to here, the scribe has to be adding stuff from his own. because the stuff in the text includes this kind of sophistication that the scribe can't add himself. Because if the scribe was adding himself, then he's actually part of the authorship. Then he's part of the one including the stories and narratives. Does that make sense? I hope that made sense. But basically, like, again, if a scribe is writing for me, they're either writing what I said verbatim, or they're including their own stuff. If they're writing what I said verbatim, that's not going to work. Because the Gospels make intricate, sophisticated cross-references and theological narratives, which cannot be conveyed orally, which will require reliance on written traditions and written sources, which they are. The Gospels do rely on written sources and traditions. Just like Matthew on the Q source and stuff like that. So, yeah. Let's see if there's any other questions. Make sure to ping me. Who were carrying the same mistake of a Hebrew gospel? Barrister asks. Who was carrying? It's pretty much the consensus of the church fathers almost. Almost all or most church fathers who mention Matthew writing a gospel and what language he wrote it in mention that he wrote in Hebrew. It's actually the neat consensus, I believe it is, and I can show you sources for this later if you like. But yeah, it's pretty much most of the church fathers say this. So they're all carrying the same mistake. It's kind of funny. Oh yeah, when does applications? Yeah, that reminds me. If anyone's interested, if you check my bio, I'm doing some private classes on Islam and Christianity. It was meant to start earlier, last month, but we haven't gotten to that. I've been busy, subhanAllah, but either later this month or something like that, we'll get those classes going and stuff like that, so everyone can learn, inshallah. And DM me for more info, but most importantly, apply in the Google Forms link so I can get your Discord username and I can DM you later, God willing. Any other questions? Let's see. Guys, if your questions was said earlier, just copy paste your question again, because I did not read the chat earlier. I'm only looking at it now. But I assume there's not much questions. If you're saying they would work with the apostle to craft it, again, that just means that the apostle is not the author. Yeah, I already answered that question. I'll answer it again. It doesn't go from John to Polycarp to Papias. It says Irenaeus says Papias heard from John, and Polycarp heard from John. So Polycarp and Papias separately heard from John. However, Polycarp didn't actually hear from John. We know this for many reasons. I'll get into it another day, inshallah. I went over some of it already now. And Papias doesn't go back to John. Even Eusebius himself argues this, and we know this for a lot of other good reasons as well. But even church fathers agree with me, like Eusebius. I don't know what else is left. Yeah, exactly. So see, like Simi is exactly right what he's saying in the chat. Then you cannot adequately ascribe authorship to John. It doesn't make sense. The authorship becomes meaningless. And if they're saying, well, all it is just showing access to eyewitness testimony, again, I told you, for example, the issue comes with Matthew and Mark and stuff like that, because we have an example with Mark. Mark is said to be the interpreter of Peter. Mark is actually claimed to be getting information from eyewitness testimony, like by church tradition, but it doesn't fit into the convention of Greco-Roman historiographies that claim to have eyewitness testimony when they have it. They break the convention. It doesn't fit at all. It's unprecedented. Scholars like Campbell Gregor say it's completely unprecedented, the silence Mark and Matthew have on having access to eyewitness testimony. Unprecedented. How sure from 1 to 100% are the letters of Paul actually from Paul? Actually, I can give you a direct answer to that with a picture. Let me show you. And actually, I can do a lecture, another day about the authorship of Pauline epistles. Let's see. I'll share with you guys this image about the Pauline epistles. Although I think when I was recording, I didn't record other people's voices, so maybe Abdurrahman's voice wasn't in that, unfortunately, but I think it's only my voice and the screen. But everyone look in the chat. This is Pauline authorship. This is actually, it's very interesting because this is one of the few things that there's actually been a very comprehensive survey on by New Testament scholars. This is from the British New Testament Conference on Pauline authorship. Basically, when it comes to Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, all the scholars agree that it's authentic. Philemon, pretty much all the scholars agree that it's authentic except one. And you can see the numbers for yourself, right? So there's like the gray area is uncertain, red area is no, and the blue area is like yes, basically, right? The slideshow will be available to look through yourselves at the end of the lecture. Yes, I can share the slideshow right now, actually. When after I'm done sharing my screen, I'll share the link to the lecture in the side chat. And you all can read it in your own time. But of course, I'll be updating it over the next few weeks and making it extremely comprehensive. The reason why Hebrews is majority rejected is because it's not even attributed to Paul by church fathers. Even the early church fathers disagreed. Like some people said it was Luke, some people said it was Paul. There's no early attestation in any way, shape, or form to Paul being the author of Hebrews, stuff like that. It's just like a random theory that's proposed. So no one actually accepts Hebrews being authored by Paul. Off topic, what time zone you know? I'm in Australian time zone, AEST. Yep, both Timothys are cooked, bruh. 1st and 2nd Timothy. Thoughts on the Corinthian Creed to prove gospel narrative. The Corinthian Creed does not give any information on the gospel narratives themselves. The gospel narratives give their own resurrection accounts, contradictory resurrection accounts. All it's evidence for is that there was people before Paul who believed in the resurrection. That's all it's evidence for. Bariso said, who said Luke was the author? Different church fathers. They said, some said it was Luke, some said it was Paul. I can get you exact names.